Mr. Rector, ladies and gentlemen, the description of my chair is complexity and uncertainty in financial markets and financial institutions. Quite a mouthful. What I would like to explain this afternoon is that there are exciting developments in science in the fields of complexity and uncertainty. And that this also applies to social sciences and so to economics. This is important because analyzing the economy through the lenses of complexity and uncertainty can contribute to good policy, management and supervision. The title of my inaugural lecture is Dealing with Complexity and Uncertainty. Almost 18 years ago, I stood here too. On the 14th of May 1996, to be exact, for what I may call now my first inaugural lecture, which had as a title Rabbit, Elephant or Rabbifant. I played with the idea of giving today's lecture the title Rabbit, Elephant or Rabbifant, Older and Wiser, with a question mark. I do hope, for those who were there at that time, at the end of my lecture it is clear why I played with that idea. It could have been like that. Macroeconomics, as you probably know, deals with the economy as a whole. How high is inflation? Is there unemployment? Economic fluctuations? That kind of issues and phenomena. Monetary theory belongs to macroeconomics, at least to a large extent. Mainstream macroeconomics is based on a number of core assumptions. They are part of the so-called macroeconomic paradigm, in the sense of Kuhn. The hardcore of the theory. I will mention 4 of these assumptions. First, people make consistent choices. They are rational. Consumers maximize their utility, firms their profits, always under restrictions, because resources are scarce. Secondly, markets are imperfect. There are several aspects. A few examples. There are constantly changing conditions in the economy. Adjustments to new conditions take time. Another aspect is that information can be distributed asymmetrically among economic agents. Furthermore, certain players have market power. The system of markets is incomplete. Lastly, some goods and services have a collective nature. There is no incentive to produce that type of goods through the market. Think, for example, of dikes. Thirdly, it is assumed irrelevant that in an economy people form a network with each other. The structure of that network is irrelevant for the results of the economic process. The economy is often analyzed on the basis of so-called representative agents. The position of the agent in the economic network and the precise relationship of such an agent to other agents is not important. There's much homogeneity and little heterogeneity assumed. This assumption makes it possible to work with linear models of aggregate variables. Equilibrium exists to describe the overall outcome of the economic process. These are endpoints of the adjustment after a change in the so-called data. For example, you can think of changes in consumer preferences or innovations in products or production methods. Finally, economic agents take their decisions in a situation of risk. This means that they are not sure about the consequences of their actions and decisions, but they have a complete overview of all the possible results. The assumed rationality makes it possible to assign quantitative probabilities to all the possible consequences of an act or a choice. The probability calculus can be used to describe the maximization of economic agents and of their expectations. In equilibrium, there's agreement between the data and expectations. Expectations play no independent role in the description of equilibrium. They adapt, so to speak, to the data. Changes in the data lead to changes in the economy. They come from outside. The economic process works in the direction of restoring equilibrium. The theory of complexity and the theory of uncertainty each indicate a problem in the paradigm of current macroeconomics. According to the theory of complex systems, an economy must be described and analyzed as a network. There's much more heterogeneity among agents than assumed. The theory of uncertainty points out that an inevitable part of human existence is that not always all possible consequences of an act or decisions can be known. Removal of each of these assumptions means a change in paradigm and macroeconomics. I would like to think in terms of a theory in which both are eliminated. I will come back to that. But first I go deeper into complexity and uncertainty. First, complexity. During the past 3 decades, we have seen very exciting developments around the topic of complexity. Starting in the middle of the 80s, with the creation of the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico, an important step towards bringing together different disciplines in which complexity was analyzed. Look around and you will see complex systems everywhere. The climate and weather are complex systems. The brains and biosystems also. But what about traffic? Traffic flows in society. Twitter and Facebook networks are self-evident examples of complex networks. And I could continue. And yes, the financial system and the economy are complex too. Before I continue, we first have to define the term complex system. Complex means, in everyday language, something different from defined here. Complex and complicated to you might well be the same, but not here. In complex systems, large numbers of units, particles or agents are connected to each other and respond to each other and their environment. There's room for much heterogeneity. And knowledge and information flows are of great importance. There's often no central control. Such complex systems have common characteristics, wherever they may appear. That requires an own methodology and language to describe and analyze them. That is why it's so interesting and important to bring scientists from different disciplines together under the umbrella of complex systems. They can learn from each other, and there's plenty of room for cross-fertilization. Complex systems cannot be described by using models of mainstream macroeconomics. What is needed, for example, is abandoning the assumption of linearity. Graph theory is that part of mathematics used to describe and analyze networks. From information technology and logic, one can draw the description analysis of interacting agents without central control, so-called cellular automata. Complex systems are evolutionary. This development can often not be described analytically. Simulation techniques play a central role. Developments in computer technology have made this kind of techniques more powerful. So-called agent-based modeling makes gratefully use of it. The aim is to simulate behavior of a complex system with many interacting agents. It is impossible at this place and moment to go very deep into the common characteristics of complex systems. But let me give you some examples. Complex systems exhibit emergent behavior. That's aggregated behavior that does not follow from the sum of behavior of individuals. The whole is more than the sum of the parts. The theory of complex systems, the outcome of the economic process, at the level of the economy as a whole, cannot be explained by aggregating behavior at micro level. Nevertheless, this assumption formed the basis of modern economics. Keynes called the error extending behavior at the micro level to the macro level the so-called fallacy of composition. Current macroeconomics is rather vulnerable to these fallacies of composition. The best known example is the so-called savings paradox. Perhaps you've heard of it. At the level of an individual, spending less of income means that automatically more is saved. At the macro level, that need not be the case. Because if people spend less, total demand and income decrease. Total savings do not increase if not more is invested. Complex systems exhibit non-linear behavior. Tensions can gradually build up. Initially, stability seems assured, but then there may be a sudden transition to an unstable regime. Very recognizable if you have the financial developments of the last 2 decades in mind. First, a relatively long period with increasing stability. In economic theory, that period was even called the period of the Great Moderation. And then the abrupt change to a deep financial crisis in 2007-2008. A final characteristic of complex system I would like to discuss has to do with the character of networks as found in practice. It relates to the number of connections that various elements or agents have with each other in a network, and what the distributions of agents of the number of connections looks like. That is almost always called a so-called power law distribution. In non-technical terms, there are relatively few agents with many connections, but more than according to the so-called normal distribution. You may have heard of the normal distribution, but the normal distribution therefore is much less normal than the name suggests. The network structure is very important, for example in epidemiology, communication theory and economics. In epidemiology, it has led to the understanding that a vaccination strategy to reduce the number of casualties as a result of infectious disease should not focus on the most vulnerable, but on the relatively small group of people with most contacts. In communication theory, we see something similar. How do you make sure that a message reaches as many people as possible, both in a business and in society? Here also the motto is to focus on the small group of people with the most contacts. And in a company that's often not determined by hierarchy, as is often assumed. In the analysis of financial stability, it is crucial to identify so-called systemically relevant financial institutions. These are the institutions that could put the whole financial system at risk in case of default. You probably know the list of 4 such banks in the Netherlands. I conclude that complex systems require their own analytical method, and that is different from what is normal in today's macroeconomics. The theory of complex systems offers an alternative paradigm to macroeconomics. Not only alternative, but also attractive, because it can analyze phenomena with which the methods of standard economics in its present form cannot or hardly can be incorporated. But the difference with standard macroeconomics goes beyond that. The same phenomena from the complexity perspective look differently. Let me give two examples. The first concerns the focus on diversification in the assessment of the exposure of banks. It is recommended to spread your exposure. Never put all eggs in one basket, as the saying goes. This principle is derived from portfolio theory for an individual bank or an individual financial institution. To conclude that a diversified financial system is more stable than a less diversified one takes no account of emergent behavior. In order to make that clear, I will now proceed from the extreme assumption that all financial institutions maximize diversification in their balance sheets. They all invest in a fully diversified portfolio worldwide. And now it comes. They are, concerning their investment profile, identical institutions. Maximum diversification therefore leads to a uniform financial system. Such financial systems are simultaneously robust but extremely vulnerable to shocks. You don't need to be a biologist to understand the importance of biodiversity. At system level, it's not diversification, but diversity that counts. This is not only an analytical point. Looking through complexity glasses can lead to radically different policy recommendations. It is clear that the stability of the financial system cannot be guaranteed by ensuring that individual financial institutions are healthy. It requires policy at the level of the system as a whole. This conclusion has been drawn as one of the lessons from the recent financial crisis. It has led to the development of so-called macroprudential policy. The analytical framework for that policy is still too little focused on the theory of complex systems. That may lead to a wrong approach. Too much focus on the same approach for all financial institutions on the basis of essentially a micro-theory can lead to a dangerous lack of diversity. I come to my second example. The second example is liquidity. In mainstream theory, the liquidity of an asset is mainly determined on the basis of the question if, in normal circumstances, that asset quickly and at little cost can be turned into money. All banks have to hold a minimum amount of liquid assets. To think that a financial system in that way is liquid and safe is an illusion. Such a financial system can be very vulnerable to common shocks or to fear or spread of local shocks. Many financial institutions want to get rid of their supposed liquid assets at the same time in such circumstances. But these assets are not liquid anymore. Prices are falling sharply, with further intensification of the crisis as a result. The recommendation from complexity theory is to define the set of liquid assets broadly and to think very carefully about design of a quote-unquote lender of last resort role of the central bank. Complexity theory thus represents an attractive approach to economics, macroeconomics in particular. So it's not surprising that during the past few decades economic applications arose, sometimes also from other disciplines. For example, see applications of principles from physics under the name econophysics. To an economist who is interested in the history of economic theory, there's something rather remarkable to notice at the same time. The recent attention to complexity in economics almost completely ignores the fact that the so-called Austrian school economics has long dealt with the fundamental role of complexity in the economy. This is most pronounced in Hayek's work, and also in that of Schumpeter, although to a lesser extent and less pronounced. In Hayek's attack on communism in the 30s of the past century, he stressed the superiority of the market mechanism in the coordination of economic decisions. Through the market mechanism, use of dispersed knowledge and information by all economic agents is possible, and use will be made of all that dispersed information and knowledge. This is information that cannot be centralized. Hayek published his vision in the 60s of the past century in the article The Theory of Complex Phenomena. A definition of what a complex system is can be distilled from it. A system is complex if it is impossible to centrally collect all the information that is necessary to describe the system completely. The economy and the financial system are complex systems in that sense. According to Hayek, this has far-reaching methodological consequences. Macroeconomic aggregates have no causal interpretation. Economics can only distinguish and analyze so-called patterns. There are limits to what we can know about economic developments. They are unpredictable in detail. This is perhaps the most important insight that economics has to offer. There is a need for research into the relationship between the Austrian analysis of complexity and the way in which the complexity of the economy is handled in modern complexity theory. The combination of complexity in the Austrian sense and the given uncertainty of the future is another line that can open new ways of thinking. Therefore, I will take you now to the second theme, and that is uncertainty. As previously stated in distinction of risk, in a situation of uncertainty, not all possible future circumstances or consequences of a decision can be known in advance. This is the case with all decisions taken beyond pure routine. It's almost always true in the case of longer-term decisions. The results of those decisions are potentially always affected by new things discovered by other people or ourselves in the future. By definition, no one knows now what will be discovered in the future. Uncertainty is inevitable. It's part of human existence. You have to deal with it daily, whether you like it or not. Keynes in 1921 and 1921 originated this theme almost a century ago, almost simultaneously. Knight especially elaborated on the unassurable nature of uncertainty and the existence of profit as a result of it. The existence of uncertainty for Keynes was the reason for the revolution in economics he thought to establish. Thought because the subject of uncertainty quickly moved to the background in mainstream macroeconomics, which developed itself on the basis of the interpretation of Hicks of the work of Keynes in quite another direction, and is based on the assumption that there is risk, no uncertainty. The so-called post-Keynesian school maintains that current macroeconomics ignores something essential to the way in which the economy operates. And for the methodology of economics, this neglect is not innocuous. It's a logical error with a large impact. Taking uncertainty seriously leads to a fundamentally different view of the economy and also of economics. Just as taking complexity seriously, it also opens a different perspective and leads to a different paradigm. Let me outline the core of that other vision. That's easiest done by comparing the role of expectations between the mainstream and the post-Keynesian vision. The mainstream is based on so-called rational expectations, as mentioned previously. Although, in that view, the future is probabilistic, it is predetermined objectively. It is to the economic agents to discover that future. Expectations are passive. They don't determine the future. The alternative vision turns this on its head. Expectations are imaginations of the unknowable future. Economic agents act on the basis of their imagination of the future. Thus they shape the future. And technical developments and preferences are thus formed and influenced. Expectations are anything but passive. They determine developments. Imaginations determine economic and social fundamentals and not the other way around. Both the consideration of the complexity of the economic system and the existence of uncertainty lead to a different view of the economy. There's need for an approach that includes both perspectives. The uncertainty of the future is inevitable. And modern economies, financial systems, and financial institutions are and need to be complex. The economy and the financial system are open-ended, complex systems. They have no known final goal or long-term equilibrium. Their development is unpredictable. This approach is not only an alternative to mainstream macroeconomics, also many models in modern complexity theory are not equipped for the study of economic development and that of other social systems. They assume a world in which there is no uncertainty, but just risk. The vision of Hayek and the Austrians can be combined with a world of uncertainty in the meaning of Knight and Keynes. That is the foundation of my thinking and analysis of the economy, financial markets, firms and financial institutions. A crucial conclusion on that basis is that social and economic developments cannot be predicted in detail and cannot be controlled centrally in the full way. I often observe two responses to this claim. First are the attempts to make the unknowable knowable and the immeasurable measurable. In short, try to replace uncertainty with risk. This doesn't lead to anything, it goes nowhere. That the future is unknowable is an inherent characteristic of human existence. This then often leads to the second response. If the future cannot be described in terms of risk, there is no basis whatsoever for analysis, let alone a scientific one. People then continue on the road they already followed. They continue to think and look at society and the economy from the mainstream paradigm. But that response is not logical. Since its origin, mankind had to deal with uncertainty. Mankind was, is and will be forced to struggle with uncertainty. And they have been tremendously successful at doing so. Mankind has been grappling with complexity for a long time. It may well be that a social system must be complex if it is to develop and adapt to changing circumstances. It is true, paradise on earth has not been established. But establishing a perfect world is too ambitious. that is not within our limited capabilities. But at the same time, enormous progress has been made. Welfare has increased greatly, and in the light of the enormous spread of knowledge and the knowability of the future, the stability of Western economies is perhaps much more surprising than their periodic instability. How have we been successful? How do we deal with the unavoidable uncertainty and complexity? These are analytical questions of great importance, and answering those questions does not defy scientific methods and analysis. But these are methods other than those of mainstream macroeconomics, which cannot answer these questions. Answering these questions requires a different paradigm in which we will observe the world differently, look at other things, and in which these will be described by other methods. That other paradigm implies another claim on what we know about social and economic developments. Science has no detailed predictions about the economy or a blueprint for progress. That in itself is a very important insight, but it also calls for modesty. Economics is not more or less than a language and an analytical instrument for economic issues at specific moments and specific places, and to distinguish abstract patterns and mechanisms. It is, as the early 20th century economist Marshall said, economics is not a body of concrete truth, but an engine for the discovery of concrete truth. The alternative paradigm is multidisciplinary, viewed from the current classification of sciences. It focuses on the response of man to uncertainty and complexity. For example, in the evolutionary development of institutions, of which the operation of the market and money are important examples. But also on the legal framework, morals and ethics. Without historical awareness, economic and social developments cannot be understood. Dealing with uncertainty means choosing between action or inaction. That puts the spotlight on entrepreneurship and leadership. Mathematics is an indispensable language to describe abstract patterns in networks and emergent behavior. Also, logic and information technology provide fruitful methods and techniques. The alternative paradigm is a fertile soil for the analysis of a number of questions on social complex systems, such as the economy and the financial system. Let me just mention 3 examples of this in my own area of financial markets and financial institutions. Is the financial system more stable or less stable if there is a cap on the size of a bank? Is it more stable when retail and investment banks are separate, or trading of banks is limited? What is the impact of the centralization of trade in so-called derivatives via central counterparties? The understanding that complexity and uncertainty cannot be escaped leads to the conclusion that we have to live and deal with these phenomena as well as possible. This requires a radical change to the mindset of many people. Accept that not everything can be controlled, and that the only certainty there is that we will be surprised. There's a broad range of topics to be discussed and studied. There are 2 main connected themes: sustainability and development. They're not only questions, but also some answers already. Dealing with uncertainty and complexity means looking differently at things, to look at other things, and do things differently. In governance, in policy and in supervision. Take, for example, the supervision of banks. Taking account of uncertainty and complexity leads to a different supervision. Less attention for diversification, more for diversity. No risk-weighted capital requirements, but focus on the relationship between capital and the size of total assets. That's the so-called leverage ratio. A broad definition of liquid assets should be used for liquidity requirements. Much less emphasis on so-called risk-oriented supervision. Instead, much more surveillance. Dig deeper and aimed at any problems found. Another strategy to collect data on the basis of a different analytical framework for real macroprudential analysis. Much more emphasis on the possibility to use and restore buffers instead of at the minimum level. And less detailed supervision on the basis of a forest of rules and more on the basis of the principles of prudent behavior. More focused on the internal supervisors of the bank than on the executive board. I come to a conclusion. It's an honor and pleasure for me to hold this chair on complexity and uncertainty in financial markets and financial institutions at this 400-year-old University of Groningen. I aim to contribute to the development of people via education and the organization and promotion of research, that so they are well equipped to navigate the complex and always uncertain world, and so to contribute indirectly to good governance, policy and supervision. Thank you for your attention.